She was rescued from the blizzard, only to find herself trapped in a dead woman's home. Abandoned by her fiancé, at 8 months pregnant, her world had ended. But when a giant, haunted stranger pulled her back from the brink of death, it was the beginning of a new story. One of buried secrets, healing scars, and a family forged from the broken pieces. The Cascade Mountains did not offer comfort. They offered a cold granite judgment against the bruised twilight sky. At a desolate bus stop on the edge of the Oregon National Forest, where the road seemed to surrender to the wilderness, Clara Mae Thompson sat, waiting. The rough wood of the bench was a poor comfort, and she shifted, trying to ease the persistent ache in her lower back. 8 months pregnant, she felt every bit the fragile city bird stranded far from its nest. She pulled her thin wool coat tighter, a garment meant for crisp autumn afternoons in the city, not the bone-deep chill of a coming mountain storm. Her fingers, trembling more from anxiety than cold, traced the worn floral pattern on her dress, a dress bought for a different life, a life that was supposed to start today. She reread the last message from Richard for the 10th time, the screen a hopeful glow in the fading light. Almost there. Our new life is waiting. The words were a fragile shield against the creeping dread. He had described it all so perfectly. A small house just outside Aspen Creek, a teaching job for her at the local school, a future as solid as the surrounding pines. All she had to do was take the bus to this final stop, and he would be here to meet her. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not as a gentle dusting, but as sharp, determined specks against the gray air. A particularly vicious gust of wind rattled the flimsy shelter, and the baby inside her gave a sudden, powerful kick, as if sensing its mother's rising panic. "It's all right, little one," she whispered, her hand instinctively cupping her swollen belly. "He's coming." But the road remained empty. The forest held its breath, dark and immense. The silence was broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the eaves. Then the phone in her hand chimed, the sound sharp and almost violent in the profound quiet. Relief washed over her in a dizzying wave. He was here. He was just late. But the message on the screen was not an apology. It was an execution. 3 short sentences that severed her past from her future. "I can't. Don't look for me. It's over." The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the wooden planks. The light from its screen was a cruel, mocking eye before it flickered and died. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. She couldn't breathe. The cold she felt now had nothing to do with the weather. It was an internal winter, freezing her from the inside out. The world narrowed to the groan of the wind and the swirling white curtain of snow that was now falling in earnest, erasing the road, the forest, and any hope of rescue. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, facing the fury of nature itself, with only the ghost of a broken promise to keep her warm. 5 miles up the mountain, Elias Eli Vance felt the storm's true teeth. It was a living thing, a predator of ice and wind that hunted these slopes every winter. He knew its habits, its patterns, the way it could turn a familiar trail into a treacherous white void in a matter of minutes. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Scout, picked its way through the deepening snow with the sure-footedness of a creature born to this landscape. Eli was on his final patrol, a last check of the lower access roads before the blizzard sealed the mountain off from the world below. It was a grim, necessary ritual, one he'd performed alone for the last 3 years. He was about to turn Scout back toward the ranger station when a flicker of color through the swirling snow snagged his attention, a pale, washed-out blue that had no place in the muted palette of the wilderness. He reined the horse to a halt, his eyes narrowing against the wind, the bus shelter. There was a figure inside, small and huddled. For a moment his mind refused to process it. No one in their right mind would be out here, not now. But as a gust of wind tore a temporary rift in the white curtain, the image sharpened. A woman, her belly swollen with child, her posture one of utter desolation. Ice, colder than the wind, shot through Eli's veins. He'd seen a ghost, not literally, but the image struck a nerve so raw, so deep, that he physically recoiled. 3 years ago, a different storm, just as vicious. Lily, his Lily, caught in a sudden squall on the north ridge, her red coat a beacon of hope that had faded with the light. He remembered the frantic search, the gut-wrenching futility, the silence of the snow when they finally found her. Now, seeing this stranger in the same unforgiving circumstances felt like a cruel trick of memory, a fresh haunting. His first instinct, raw and powerful, was to turn away, to spur Scout onward and leave the ghost behind. Not his business, not his fight, not again. The past was a wound that had never properly healed, and a blizzard was no place for old scars to be ripped open. He had learned the hard way that the mountains took what they wanted, and a man was a fool to stand in their way. He nudged the horse forward, his jaw set like stone. But he only made it 10 paces. The ranger in him, the part forged by years of training and a deeply ingrained sense of duty, refused to let him go. He was a rescuer. It was who he was, even when the man inside him wanted to be nothing more than a hermit. He couldn't unsee her. He couldn't leave her to the mercy of a storm he knew she would not survive. Cursing softly under his breath, a sound swallowed by the wind, Eli pulled hard on the reins. Scout stopped, turning his head as if questioning the command. Without a word, Eli guided the horse around, his shoulders squared against the wind, and began the slow ride back toward the woman in the storm. The ghost would have to wait. The living could not. The horse materialized from the blizzard like a creature from a ghost story, its form solidifying in the swirling chaos. The man atop it was immense, a silhouette carved from the mountain itself, his shoulders broad against the driving snow. When Clara saw him, her first coherent thought was not of rescue, but of a primal, cornered fear. He dismounted, and the sheer scale of him was even more imposing on the ground. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, his heavy boots crunching in the snow, his eyes shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. Clara shrank back against the splintered wood of the shelter, one hand flying instinctively to her belly. He stopped a few feet away, a silent giant wrapped in canvas and frost. He didn't speak. Instead, his gloved fingers worked at the buckles of his heavy oilskin coat. It was a gesture of such unexpectedness that it broke through her terror. He pulled the coat free, and the wind immediately whipped at his flannel shirt. Without a word of explanation, he stepped forward and draped the massive garment over her narrow shoulders. It enveloped her, heavy and smelling of pine, snow, and something distinctly masculine, its residual warmth a shocking comfort against her frozen skin. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. It wasn't a conversation. It was a statement of fact. "You're coming with me." She looked from his unreadable face to the vast, hostile wilderness, then back again. There was no choice, and they both knew it. Numbly, she allowed him to take her small, threadbare bag. His hands, weathered and strong, were surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet and guided her toward the patient horse. With an ease that belied her clumsy, pregnant state, he lifted her into the saddle, then swung up behind her, his body creating a solid wall that instantly shielded her from the wind's sharpest bite. The journey was a blur of white fury. The world beyond the immediate circle of the horse and rider ceased to exist. Clara clung to the saddle horn, the horse's powerful rhythmic gait a steady reassurance beneath her. The man's arms were a protective cage around her as he held the reins, his presence a constant solid warmth against her back. He navigated the treacherous, invisible trail with an instinct born of deep familiarity, murmuring low commands to the horse that were lost in the storm's howl. For the first time since reading Richard's message, the frantic terror in Clara's chest began to subside, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of security. This silent stranger was her only anchor in the storm, and as the horse pushed onward through the blinding snow, she held on to that fact as if it were life itself. The cabin appeared through the snow like a promise. It was a solid, handsome structure of dark, fitted logs, with a stone chimney breathing a steady plume of smoke into the storm. A single golden light glowed from a window, a beacon in the hostile white world. Eli helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist, steadying her as her trembling legs found the ground. He led her to the door and pushed it open, ushering her out of the storm's fury and into a profound, enveloping quiet. The warmth was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to thaw her right to the bone. It radiated from a large cast-iron stove in the corner, its embers glowing sleepily. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint, pleasant scent of dried herbs. "Get warm by the fire," Eli said, his voice still low. He helped her out of his massive, snow-dampened coat. "I need to see to Scout. Won't be long." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze sweeping over the room, before turning and disappearing back into the blizzard, the door closing with a soft, solid thud behind him. Left alone, Clara took a proper look around. The cabin was larger than it appeared, with a main room that served as both a kitchen and living space. It was meticulously clean and orderly, but it was not the Spartan bachelor's home she might have expected. A hand-stitched quilt, its colors muted and earthy, was folded neatly over the back of a rocking chair. On the rough-hewn mantel above the fireplace, a small vase held the delicate, dried heads of summer wildflowers. A shelf of well-read books drew her eye, and next to it, a single coffee mug with a pattern of painted bluebirds sat beside the sink, as if waiting for its owner to return. It was a home built with care, with a palpable sense of love in every detail. A woman's touch was everywhere. And then she saw it. On the center of the mantel stood a simple, carved wooden frame. The photograph inside was of Eli, younger, a rare, wide smile on his face. His arm was wrapped around a woman with dark, laughing eyes and a cascade of hair that the wind had caught mid-tumble. Lily. She was vibrant, beautiful, and so clearly the heart of this home that Clara felt a pang of something sharp and unwelcome. She was an intruder. This was not a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a shrine to a memory so powerful it felt like a living presence. The warmth from the fire suddenly felt oppressive. She had been rescued from the storm outside, only to walk directly into the heart of another, one of quiet, unending grief. She was safe, and yet she had never felt more lost. Dawn broke over a world reborn in blinding white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. The sun, a stranger for days, cast a diamond-like glitter across snowdrifts that had swallowed fences and reshaped the landscape. Inside the cabin, Clara was awake, having spent the night in a small guest room that was just as neatly preserved as the main living area. She emerged to find Eli by the stove, the scent of coffee a welcome grounding aroma. He wordlessly handed her a plain white mug, a deliberate choice to avoid the bluebird one, and the quiet between them was thick with unspoken things. The peace was shattered by a series of sharp, authoritative knocks at the door. Clara saw Eli's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly before he moved to open it. The woman standing on the porch was of an age that was hard to pinpoint, her face a roadmap of the town's joys and sorrows, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried a large basket, and her eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. "Martha," Eli said, his voice holding a note of both warmth and weariness. "Elias," she replied, stepping inside and stamping snow from her boots with brisk efficiency. "Knew you'd be all right, but I had to check. Brought you some of my sourdough starter and fresh eggs." Her gaze fell upon Clara, and the warmth in her expression vanished, replaced by a polite, impenetrable mask. "And you must be the traveler." The next hour was a masterclass in subtle interrogation. Martha moved about the kitchen as if it were her own, her conversation directed at Eli, but her words intended for Clara. "This quiet always reminds me of Lily," she said, her hand brushing the back of the rocking chair. She always said a storm scours the world clean. She filled the Bluebird mug with coffee for herself, a gesture of ownership that did not go unnoticed. Every anecdote, every memory of Lily was a carefully placed stone in the wall she was building around Clara. Finally, having arranged her offerings on the counter, Martha turned her full, undivided attention to Clara. The pretense of casual conversation fell away. "Eli tells me he found you at the bus stop," she began, her tone deceptively gentle. "That's a strange place for a young woman in your condition to find herself all alone." Her eyes flickered to Clara's small bag, then back to her face. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. Then came the question, sharp and precise as a needle. "So, tell me, dear, what is it that brings you to Aspen Creek? A town like this, we tend to notice when a story doesn't quite add up." The words, cloaked in a neighborly concern, landed like a judgment. Clara felt the blood rush to her cheeks, the warmth of the stove suddenly gone. She was no longer a survivor. She was a suspect, and she realized then that the ghost of Lily didn't just haunt this cabin. It guarded the entire town, and Martha was its fiercest gatekeeper. After Martha left, the cabin was suffocatingly quiet. The air, once just still, now felt heavy with judgment. Clara retreated to a small wooden chair by the window, wrapping her arms around herself. She stared out at the pristine, sun-drenched snow, but the brilliant landscape offered no solace. All she could see were Martha's accusing eyes. All she could hear was the unspoken name that hung in every corner of the room. Lily. She felt a familiar, bitter despair begin to creep back in, the same kind she'd felt at the bus stop. She had escaped one prison only to find herself in another, a beautiful cage of someone else's memories. Eli watched her from across the room. He moved with a restless energy, adding an unnecessary log to the already roaring fire, wiping down a counter that was already clean. He was a man comfortable in the solitude of the wilderness, but the charged, emotional silence of this room was a territory he navigated with unease. He saw the wounded look in Clara's eyes, a look he had put there by bringing her into his world, his past. He finally stopped his pacing and stood by the mantel, his large frame partially obscuring the photograph of his wife. He cleared his throat. "Martha, she can be a lot," he began, his voice low. "She loved Lily like a daughter. She's just protective." Clara didn't respond, her gaze remaining fixed on the snow outside. Eli's eyes went to the photograph, and his next words were quieter, addressed more to the memory than to Clara. "It wasn't a sickness that took her," he said, the admission costing him a visible effort. "Everyone in town thinks so. It's easier that way." He paused, and the silence that followed was so profound that Clara could hear the soft crackle of the fire and the frantic beat of her own heart. She finally turned to look at him. His face was a mask of controlled pain. "It was in the spring," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The first big thaw. We'd had a stupid argument that morning, about something I can't even remember now. She went for a walk to clear her head, up on Sunset Ridge." He pointed vaguely toward the window at a massive, snow-covered peak in the distance. "I'd been up there myself just hours before. I told her the trail was clear. I told her it was safe." The last word caught in his throat. But the melt. It had washed out a section from underneath. There was a patch of ice, covered with a dusting of fresh snow. It looked like solid ground. He finally met Clara's eyes, and the guilt she saw there was so raw, so absolute, it stole her breath. "By the time I found her, it was too late." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and irrevocable. Clara felt tears well in her eyes, but not of pity. It was a profound, aching empathy. The rescuer, the stoic giant, who had pulled her from the storm, was carrying a wound far deeper than her own. He wasn't just grieving a loss. He was serving a life sentence for a crime he believed he'd committed. In that moment, the ghost of Lily ceased to be a rival. She became a shared sorrow. The wall between them didn't just crack, it crumbled into dust. They were no longer a rescuer and his charge. They were simply two broken people, bound by the silent, tragic language of their scars. The days that followed Eli's confession were filled with a new kind of quiet. The heavy, sorrowful silence was replaced by a softer, more thoughtful stillness. The immense space of Eli's grief, now that it had been given a name, seemed to leave a little more room for the present to breathe. Restless and needing a purpose beyond waiting, Clara found herself drawn to the small, fenced-in area beside the cabin. It was an herb garden, mostly asleep under a blanket of snow, but here and there, the stubborn green of rosemary and the woody stems of thyme pushed through, defiant against the frost. As a librarian, she knew these plants from the pages of books, but seeing them in person, feeling the rough texture of their leaves, was different. She knelt, her movements careful, and began to gently brush the snow away from a cluster of sage, its silvery leaves fragrant even in the cold. It felt good to touch something that was alive, to engage with a world outside the confines of her own sorrow and fear. She was not trying to erase the presence that lingered here. She was simply trying to understand it. Eli watched her from the cabin porch, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He had watched over this garden for 3 years, a dormant, painful reminder of Lily's passion. He'd kept the weeds at bay, but had not truly tended it. Seeing Clara there, her touch so gentle and respectful, did not stir the jealousy or resentment he might have expected. Instead, it stirred a long-forgotten sense of peace. He went back inside, returning a few moments later with a small, leather-bound journal. He walked over to where she knelt and held it out to her. "Lily's," he said simply. "Her garden diary. She knew more about these plants than any book." Clara took the journal with a reverence that seemed to satisfy him. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping handwriting, detailed notes, and delicate sketches of leaves and flowers. Eli pointed to a hardy plant near the stone wall. "That's comfrey," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Lily called it bone knit. She made a poultice from it that could soothe any sprain or bruise. He then gestured to the sage. "She burned that in the winter, said it cleared the air of sadness." He spoke of the plants as if they were old friends, sharing Lily's knowledge, her words, her wisdom. He wasn't guarding her memory from Clara anymore. He was sharing it. As Clara listened, tracing the faded ink in the diary, the ghost of Lily transformed. She was no longer a rival or a judgment, but a teacher whose legacy was one of healing. As the pale afternoon sun dipped toward the snow-capped peaks, they stood together in the quiet garden, a fragile bridge forming between his past and her uncertain future, built from the simple, honest language of the earth. A comfortable quiet had settled into the cabin in the week following their shared moments in the garden. A routine, unspoken but steady, had formed between them. Evenings were spent by the fire, Eli mending a piece of tack or oiling his boots, Clara reading one of the books from Lily's collection. The silence was no longer a void, but a shared space, a testament to the fragile peace they had brokered with the past. Tonight, a log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. Clara smiled, looking down at the page of the book in her lap, when a sudden, powerful movement inside her made her gasp. It was not a gentle flutter, but a solid, insistent kick, a communication from the small life she carried. The book slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Instantly, Eli was alert, his head snapping up. "You all right?" he asked, the practiced calm of a rescuer in his voice, but his eyes held a sharp concern. "Is it the baby?" A genuine, unburdened smile touched Clara's lips for the first time since she'd arrived. "I'm fine," she assured him, her voice soft. "He's just making his presence known tonight." Another strong kick followed, and she laughed quietly. She looked at Eli, at his large, weathered hands resting on his knees, hands that had saved her, hands that carried so much sorrow. An impulse, warm and undeniable, rose within her. She wanted, more than anything, to share this moment of pure, uncomplicated life with him. "Here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. She held out her hand. He looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face, a question in his eyes. He hesitated for a long beat, the space between them charged with a new and unfamiliar energy. Then, slowly, he reached out and allowed her to take his hand. His skin was calloused and warm. Gently, she guided his palm to rest on the curve of her belly. For a moment, there was nothing but the heat of his hand through the thin fabric of her dress. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then it happened. A firm, unmistakable thump against the very center of his palm. The effect on Eli was immediate and profound. The careful, stoic mask he wore every day simply dissolved. His eyes widened with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder, his lips parting slightly in disbelief. After 3 years of living in a house haunted by the silence of a life that was lost, here was an undeniable, vigorous whisper of a life that was just beginning. He stared down at her belly, as if he were witnessing a miracle. His hand remained perfectly still, as if afraid to break the spell. When he finally looked up at her, the deep, guarded sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something she had never seen there before: hope. "He's strong," Eli murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. In the warm glow of the firelight, a single, shared tear traced a path down Clara's cheek. The tiny, insistent life within her had reached out and touched not one, but 2 lonely hearts. The fragile peace that had settled in the cabin was shattered by the sound of a horse's approach. It was Martha, making her way up the mountain pass on what was likely an unofficial mail run now that the lower roads were clearing. She carried a canvas sack, and her expression when Clara opened the door was one of carefully constructed neutrality. She exchanged a few pleasantries with Eli about the weather, before turning to Clara, pulling a crisp, white envelope from her bag. "This was forwarded to the post office in town," she said, her eyes watching Clara's reaction with keen interest. "From back east, it looks like." Clara's heart went cold. She recognized the elegant, sharp slant of her older sister's handwriting immediately. She took the letter with a hand that trembled slightly, murmuring a thank you. She waited until Martha had left and Eli was occupied in the woodshed before she dared to open it. Her sister's words were as sharp and unforgiving as the broken edge of a teacup. "Clara," it began, with no warmth or affection. "After weeks of searching, to find you have hidden yourself in some God-forsaken wilderness is beyond comprehension. Father refuses to even speak your name. You have no idea the shame this whole affair has brought upon us." Each sentence was a cold slap, a reminder of the world she had fled, a world of appearances, of reputation, of love that was conditional and easily revoked. The letter went on, outlining in chillingly practical terms the family's solution. Enclosed was a one-way train ticket back to Boston. An arrangement had been made with a discreet couple, friends of their father, who were unable to have children of their own. They would adopt the baby, the matter would be handled quietly, and Clara would be allowed to resume her life. "Once you have recovered and put this regrettable chapter behind you." The letter was a lifeline back to everything she had ever known, and a death sentence for the child she carried. It was a choice between a cold, familiar prison and a terrifying, unknown freedom. Her gaze drifted around the rustic cabin, the field guides on the shelf, the scent of wood smoke, the empty rocking chair where Lily's presence still lingered. She thought of Eli's quiet, steady kindness, the raw guilt in his eyes when he spoke of his wife, the look of pure wonder on his face when he had felt her baby move. That world, this world, was complicated and full of sorrow, but it was real. She looked down at the paper in her hands. The letter from her sister felt like a relic from another lifetime. The train ticket tucked inside represented an escape, a way to undo the damage and be the daughter her father wanted, but the price was a part of her soul. She pressed a hand to her belly, where a gentle flutter reminded her of the life that was wholly dependent on her courage. The choice, she realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, was no choice at all. But what that meant for her future, and for the man in the woodshed, she did not know. Clara spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet turmoil. The letter and the train ticket sat on the corner of the small kitchen table, a silent, damning indictment of her life. Every so often, her eyes would be drawn to them, to the neat, familiar handwriting that now felt like a stranger's, to the crisp edges of the ticket that promised a return to a world she no longer recognized. The cabin, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a temporary hiding place she had no claim to. She was a guest in a stranger's home, a ghost in the making. Late in the afternoon, needing to escape the suffocating presence of the letter, she heard a noise from the attached woodshed, a space she hadn't yet entered. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across a rough floor. Drawn by a need for any distraction, she pushed open the heavy wooden door and peered inside. The air was cool and smelled sharply of cedar sawdust and oil. In the center of the cluttered but organized space, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from a rafter, stood Eli. He had just pulled a large canvas-draped object from a dark corner. He saw her then, hesitating in the doorway, but his expression held no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness. He seemed to accept her presence as inevitable. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the dusty canvas away. Underneath sat a wooden cradle. It was beautifully made from golden pine, its lines simple and strong, but it was heartbreakingly incomplete. The headboard was carved with delicate, intertwining branches, but one side was missing entirely, and the curved rockers lay unattached on the floor beside it. It was a promise that had been abandoned halfway. Clara felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't need to ask. "I started it right after we got married," Eli said, his voice rough as he ran a hand over the smooth, unfinished wood. "For the baby Lily and I were planning on." He said it simply, a statement of a past that was as solid and real as the wood beneath his fingers. Clara expected him to cover it again, to push the painful memory back into the shadows. Instead, he looked from the cradle to her, his gaze holding hers for a long, meaningful moment. Then he turned, walked to his workbench, and picked up a block of sandpaper. He returned to the cradle and, with a steady, rhythmic motion, began to sand the headboard. The soft, scraping sound was the only noise in the workshop, a sound of purpose, of continuation. Shh, shh, shh. He was not looking at her, but the action was for her. It wasn't about the past. It was a silent, powerful statement about the future. He was building a place for her child. Clara watched for a moment longer, her heart pounding with a painful, beautiful clarity. She quietly backed out of the workshop, pulling the door gently closed behind her, leaving him to his work. She walked back into the cabin, straight to the table. She picked up her sister's letter and the train ticket, walked to the cast-iron stove, and lifted the heavy iron lid. Without a moment of hesitation, she dropped the papers into the glowing orange embers. She watched as the cruel words and the false promise of an easy escape curled into black ash and disappeared forever. Her old life was gone. She was home. The peace was short-lived. 2 weeks later, a new storm descended from the north, a monster of a blizzard that made the first one feel like a mere squall. The wind shrieked like a freight train, and the snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet of white. It was in the heart of this maelstrom that Clara felt the first sharp, unmistakable pain low in her back. It was too soon, weeks too soon. She tried to breathe through it, to tell herself it was nothing but another pain, stronger this time, wrapped around her belly like an iron band. She told Eli, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't hide. As he absorbed the news, his face grim, a faint, struggling light appeared through the swirling snow outside the window. It was a lantern, bobbing erratically. Martha. Her intuition, honed by a lifetime on the mountain, must have screamed at her that something was wrong. But as they watched, the light faltered, dipped violently, and was extinguished, swallowed by a massive snowdrift 100 yards from the cabin. They were trapped in a double-edged nightmare. Clara was in labor, and their only hope for experienced help was now in mortal danger herself. There was no choice. "Boil water. Keep the fire hot," Eli commanded, his voice all ranger now, calm and authoritative. "I'm going after her." Before Clara could protest, he was pulling on his heavy gear and plunging out into the blinding fury of the storm. The minutes he was gone felt like an eternity, each one punctuated by another contraction, each one stronger than the last. Finally, the door burst open, bringing with it a blast of snow and wind. Eli half-carried a shaking, half-frozen Martha inside. He had found her just as the cold was beginning to claim her, her old horse having panicked in a deep drift. They were safe, but they were trapped, and the baby was coming. Martha, though shaken, tried to take command, her years of experience taking over. But as the hours wore on, it became clear this was not a normal birth. The pains were relentless, and the baby was not progressing as it should. The confidence drained from Martha's face, replaced by a creeping fear. In the flickering lamplight, her hands began to tremble. Finally, she looked at Eli, her pride shattered. "Elias," she whispered, her voice cracking, I don't know. I've never seen a labor this difficult without a doctor. I'm scared I'll do the wrong thing." In that moment of terrifying honesty, the last wall between them crumbled. All pretense, all history was stripped away. There was only the roaring wind outside and the life-or-death struggle within. Clara, drawing on a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, focused her mind. "Ask me questions, Martha," she said through gritted teeth. "Tell me what you see." Eli, his face a mask of focus, moved to Clara's side, his hands steady, his knowledge of emergency first aid kicking in. He became Martha's hands, and Clara became her eyes. The outsider, the rescuer, and the gatekeeper became a single, desperate team, fighting against the storm within and the storm without for the one precious life that bound them all together. The world narrowed to the four walls of the cabin, to the flickering lamplight, and to the rhythm of pain. Time ceased to be measured in minutes or hours, but in the agonizing crest and fall of each contraction. Through it all, Eli was a rock, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her senses, his hands sure and competent as he followed Martha's strained instructions. Martha, her own fear burned away by the raw immediacy of the struggle, was focused and fierce. They worked as one, a trinity bound by the primal, desperate fight for life. Clara pushed through a wave of pain so immense she thought it would tear her in two, clinging to Eli's hand as if it were the only solid thing left in the universe. She was nothing but strength and will, a force of nature answering the call of another. Then, in a final, all-consuming effort, there was a sense of release, a sudden, shocking stillness. The roaring in her ears stopped. The only sound was the muffled howl of the wind outside. And then a new sound split the air, a cry, not of pain, but of indignant, healthy rage. It was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. Tears of sheer, bone-deep relief streamed down her face as Eli worked with a swift, practiced tenderness. He cleared the baby's airway, tied off the cord, and wrapped the squirming, crying bundle in a clean, warm blanket. Martha was weeping silently, her face a mixture of exhaustion and profound awe. "You did it, Clara," Eli said, his voice thick with an emotion that cracked his usual stoicism. "It's a girl, a perfect, healthy girl." He gently placed the baby on Clara's chest. The moment their skin touched, the baby's cries softened to a small murmur. Clara looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, the shock of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers that curled instinctively around her own. All the pain, all the betrayal and fear of the past months simply melted away, replaced by a love so fierce and absolute it was breathtaking. As she looked at her daughter, the storm outside seemed to give one last weary sigh, and then fell silent. Through the frost-covered window, the first pale grey light of dawn began to pierce the darkness. A single golden ray of sun broke through the clouds and sliced across the room, illuminating the tiny, perfect face in her arms. "Hope," Clara whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. "Her name is Hope." Martha stepped forward, all the hardness gone from her face, replaced by a soft, grandmotherly tenderness. She gently touched the baby's cheek with a crooked finger. "She's a fighter," Martha said, her eyes lifting to meet Clara's with a look of deep, undisguised respect. "Just like her mother." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed her entire face. "Welcome to Aspen Creek, little Hope." In the quiet, sun-drenched cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of the night and the promise of a new day, the ghost of the past finally receded, making way for the solid, warm, living miracle of the present. When the great melt finally came and the mountain passes were deemed safe, Eli drove them into town. It was the first time Clara had seen Aspen Creek, and viewed not through a curtain of snow, but under a bright, benevolent sun, it was a place of quiet, rugged charm. Nestled in the valley, with a single main street and wooden storefronts, it felt like a town that kept its own time. Baby Hope, bundled warmly in a blanket Martha had knitted, slept soundly in her mother's arms. Martha herself was waiting for them on the steps of the town courthouse, her presence no longer a source of anxiety for Clara, but one of solid, reassuring friendship. They went directly to the chambers of Judge Hemlock, a man with kind eyes and a face as weathered as the mountains he called home. The office smelled of old paper and wood polish, a place of quiet, solemn tradition. The first matter of business was a stack of papers Eli had prepared. The judge read them carefully, then looked at Eli over the top of his spectacles. "So, you wish to legally adopt the child, Hope, as your own daughter?" Eli stood tall, his hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady. "In every way that matters, she is already my daughter. This is just to make it right in the eyes of the law." The judge nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his gaze. He stamped the papers with a heavy, final seal. In the quiet of the room, with a few strokes of a pen, a legal bond was forged that mirrored the one already written on Eli's heart. He was a father. Clara thought that was the end of it. But as the judge set the adoption papers aside, Eli turned to her. He didn't get down on one knee. It wasn't his way. Instead, he took her free hand, his large, calloused fingers enveloping hers. "Clara May Thompson," he began, his voice low and earnest. "We've done everything backwards. We met in a storm, became a family in another, and I've loved you longer than I've known you, I think." He took a breath. "I can't promise you an easy life, but I can promise to stand by you, to cherish you and our daughter through whatever storms may come. Will you be my wife?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy blurred Clara's vision. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." Judge Hemlock smiled, a broad, genuine grin. "Well," he said, reaching for another set of forms. "Seems to me we have all the necessary parties right here." The ceremony was brief, simple, and more beautiful than any grand wedding Clara had ever imagined. With Martha as their witness, they exchanged simple vows, promises not of perfection, but of unwavering partnership and love. When it came time to sign the marriage license, Eli signed his name, then Clara signed hers, her new name, her true name. As the judge reached for his final stamp, he paused. "I believe a union this special requires a special witness." With Martha's help, They gently took a fussy, sleepy Hope from Clara's arms, pressed her tiny foot onto an ink pad, and then carefully onto the bottom of the certificate, a perfect miniature seal. "Then it's done," the judge declared, his voice full of warmth. "By the authority vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." He looked at the three of them, father, mother, and child, a family forged in a blizzard and sealed in love. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance." 1 year later, spring returned to the Cascades, not as a hesitant promise, but as a riotous, joyful celebration of life. The afternoon sun warmed the small valley, and nowhere was its touch more welcome than in the garden beside the cabin. It was no longer just Lily's garden. It was now a thriving, beautiful collaboration. Her healing herbs, the comfrey and the sage, grew in abundance, their sturdy roots a testament to the past. But now, intertwined with them, were Clara's additions. Rows of sturdy tomato plants, climbing beans that spiraled up new poles, and bright, cheerful marigolds to keep the pests at bay. Clara, now the beloved teacher at the Aspen Creek schoolhouse, knelt in the soft earth, showing a delighted Martha a particularly promising squash blossom. Their friendship, forged in the fire of that terrible night, had become one of the foundational stones of Clara's new life. A shriek of pure toddler joy made them both look up. Hope, her dark hair now a wild halo of curls, had just taken 3 wobbly, triumphant steps on the grass before tumbling harmlessly near a patch of mint. Eli, leaning against the porch railing, let out a soft, proud laugh. The change in him was the most profound transformation of all. The haunted, grieving man who had rescued her from the storm was gone, replaced by a husband and father whose eyes crinkled with an easy smile. The deep lines of sorrow around his mouth had been softened by contentment. He looked at his wife and daughter, his 2 miracles, and the love in his gaze was as vast and steady as the mountains themselves. Later that evening, after Martha had gone home, Eli and Clara stood together in the garden as the setting sun painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Hope was asleep inside, tucked securely into the cradle that Eli had finished with such loving care. He slipped his arms around Clara's waist from behind, and she leaned back against his solid chest, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him. "A year ago," she said softly, her voice full of wonder, "I was sitting at that bus stop, thinking my life was over." He rested his chin on the top of her head. "A year ago," he replied, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "I was just a ghost, rattling around in an empty house." He tightened his embrace. "Then you and that little girl of ours brought the world back to life." She turned in his arms to face him, a gentle, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Well," she said, taking his large, weathered hand in hers, "I hope you have plenty of energy." She guided his palm to rest on her still flat stomach, a mirror of that first tentative gesture by the fire. "Because it looks like our world is about to get a little bigger." He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, and when he saw the happy, certain truth there, a look of pure, unadulterated joy washed over his face. He let out a whoop of laughter that echoed in the quiet valley and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as the last of the sunlight bathed them in gold. He was no longer a grieving heart, and she was no longer an abandoned bride. They were a family, strong and rooted, standing in a garden of their own making, ready to welcome the seasons to come, a living testament to the truth that even after the harshest winter, love could always, always find a way to bloom.